Cascading Style Sheets have two main functions, page layout and content formatting. If you have started web page layout with CSS but encountered problems, this tutorial is for you. Here are the properties most relevant to CSS page layout: display, position, float, z-index and visibility. Their values are not all equally important, so let's go through them. The inherit value is valid for all of the properties and simply sets the value to that of the parent object. For the sake of clarity, in this tutorial all values are declared explicitly, we don't use inherit. List item and table values for the display property are used to format lists and tables and are not very relevant to standard layouts. The non-display value removes the element from document flow and is useful for changing and dynamic layouts. We're concerned with the initial process of creating a layout, so we don't use it. Static is the default positioning type, and it simply means the object is part of the regular flow in the document. Relative positioning type works the same, but it also allows an offset to be specified. To keep things simple, we don't use static in this tutorial, we use relative. The float value of none is the default. For initial creation of layout structure, we don't need it. The z-index property is used for changing the stacking order of positioned, overlapping objects, with auto being the default value. Stacking order isn't much of an issue in basic standard layouts, so we don't use this property at all. Visibility controls object visibility without affecting layout. The collapse value is an advanced feature, while visible and hidden are self-explanatory. Again, we don't need this property in initial layout design. This leaves us with three CSS properties and their most useful values, but it doesn't end here. The default display value is inline, and it simply means the object is part of the regular flow from left to right and down line by line in the way that text flows. For layout purposes, it isn't much use. Although inline is explained in this tutorial, we don't use it. Similarly, for the fixed position type, fixed works the same as absolute. That is, the object is taken out of the document flow and positioned with reference to a frame. The only difference with fixed is that the referenced frame is always the window. Unlike absolute positioning, a fixed object is not placed in the document, but remains pinned to the window and therefore is not affected by scrolling. Once you know how to use absolute, you will have no trouble using fixed. In this tutorial, we don't use it. And here we are. We have reduced things down to three properties and their 6 essential values that must be understood to be able to create web page layouts. And this really is the secret to success. Two things to note before we move on. Everything is a box in CSS, and the three box types, inline, inline block, and block, are interchangeable. HTML tags have default displayed value, but can be changed to any other. So for example, the div HTML tag is a block object by default, but can be changed to inline or inline block, and its behavior will change accordingly. The same goes for everything else. Another thing to bear in mind is that absolute positioning is referenced to the browser window if the parent element of the object is not positioned with the position property. This often catches out novice users. Okay, let's take a look at each of these values in turn, starting with the inline display value. I'm using a sentence one word after another and then some, each word marked with a bold HTML tag and a class that I named inline. The class is used to create the red boxes, with display set to inline and position to relative, the same as the default behavior for text. Notice that while padding, margin and border are respected, the setting of height for the word "and" is not. In addition, as the words flow left to right and down line by line, the boxes overlap. You can see quickly that inline isn't going to be of much use in page layout. Compare this to inline block, same setup except for the display value. Now the flow is the same, but the spatial properties such as height are respected and affect the line height. Inline blocks are useful in layouts as they can be centered on the page just like text, but because they still flow like text, they must be used with care to ensure they are stable and not jumping about as the window is resized. Blocks flow differently. They occupy their own lines or rows on the page. Two blocks do not flow one after another on the same line. To position blocks next to one another in the same row, we would need to either offset their positions if they are relative or position them with absolute. Both can be problematic. Here is the inline example again, this time with the word "and" displayed as absolutely positioned block. Notice the object is out of the flow and ignored by the rest. The situation is the same when the object is among inline blocks. The only time the block moves is when its container moves. And the same thing among other blocks. The absolute positioned block is out of the flow and its original space is taken up by the rest. Now for the float property. You can float an object left or right. The object will appear on the same line it would occupy otherwise, and it will move up or down on the page if the line moves and the rest of the text flows around it. This works for inline and inline block objects. For block objects it doesn't, as blocks occupy their entire row. Floating is usually used for image positioning in articles. In this example, the image object is displayed as inline block, positioned relative and floated right. The rest of the code creates the image object. The object remains on its line as its container is resized and the rest flows around it. We're now ready to use our knowledge and create a couple of standard layouts. We start with a layout where all elements are always visible and only the content area will scroll on overflowing content. Here is our starting code for the page. The places in the HTML document and the style sheet where our layout code will go are noted. The HTML file is as simple as it gets. Depending on what you're doing, you may need to add a doc type declaration at the top. We don't need it here, so I'm not using one. In the style sheet, we set body, margin and padding to 0 so that we're in full control of the page. Now to our first object. We start with a wrapper required for the specific purpose of ensuring that a minimum width and height of the layout are kept, even if the window is resized smaller than these dimensions. In this way, we ensure that the layout does not break down in a small window. This wrapper object is a block, absolutely positioned in relation to its container, the browser window. With all offsets at 0, the object will always be the same size as the window, or indeed the minimum size as declared. Next, the header. A block with absolute positioning, height of 100 pixels, container offsets at 0, except for bottom offset set to auto. In this way, the header remains pinned to the top of the window. Sidebar, same thing, except we pin it to the left. Top offset is 100 to make room for header, and bottom is 50 for footer. Right is now auto. Likewise, the content block. Top offset 100 for header, bottom 50 for footer, left 100 for sidebar. Overflow is set to auto so that scroll bars automatically appear on overflowing content. Finally, the footer, pinned to the bottom of the window in the same way. And that's the layout done. It scales as the window is resized and doesn't break down at very small window sizes due to the wrapper block. All that remains is to add smaller elements and formatting. Here is a mock-up of the layout populated with content. Working as expected. The other layout we'll consider is a center type, and we'll do two versions, one suitable for longer content and another for shorter content. Starting with the longer version. We create a container block that will take care of centering the column of content. A block with relative position. All of the layout elements will be positioned relative so that their flow is kept and their positions adjust to varying lengths of the content. Width at 100% of the window and minimum height set to 400 to prevent breakdown of the layout at small window sizes. The all-important property is text align. Set to center, it will act on line block boxes that this box will contain. And here is our centered block. It is centered because its display is set to inline block, meaning that it flows like text and is centered by the text align property of its parent. Width 500 and again minimum height 400. Letter and word spacing are set to 0 to minimize spacing between boxes this element will contain. The header is pinned to the top of the window by virtue of being the first item in the purple box. Width is 500 pixels, fitting the container. Height 100 pixels. The following blocks will then flow naturally from the next row. As a side note, I'm working somewhat in miniature here, so my measurements are smaller than they would be in real use. Before moving on to create the footer, we'll populate this centered block with 2 sidebars and a content block between them. I've created a sidebar with a lot of text to demonstrate how the layout adjusts to accommodate. Again, it's an inline block, relative position, the first of 3 inline block objects flowing left to right on the same line. The second is the content block. Vertical align top is required to ensure top alignment. Note that width is 290 instead of 300, which you would expect with 2 sidebars of 100 in a container of 500. 2 times 100 plus 300 equals 500. So why only 290 for the central box? This is to ensure that the second sidebar that will be added after the content box will not be pushed down to the next line in the flow. We want the layout to be stable. Depending on the browser, the value could be pushed closer to 300, but to make sure it works across all browsers, we settle on 290. This gives us a few pixels of extra margin, exposing the purple box below. In real use, this isn't a problem, as all blocks concerned would likely have the same color. Here then is our second sidebar. Vertical align top is again required to keep the sidebar at the top of the row. Finally, the footer. In HTML code, the footer is inside the centered purple box and, like the header, is positioned as a block, relative, height set to 50, width 500 pixels. And that is this layout done. It's good for longer content, not so good for shorter content. We might get a gap between the footer and the bottom of the window, like so. We could set the minimum height of the blocks to higher values to fix this, but there is also a better way. If we know the maximum height of the content, we can change the yellow wrapper box to absolute positioning with minimum height set to accommodate content up to that height. Because the block is absolutely positioned in relation to its container, the browser window, width and height being at 100%, the box will never be smaller than the window. There will never be a gap between the box and the bottom edge of the window. The centered purple box also has height of 100% of window size and will never have a gap at the bottom of the window. Because the maximum height of the blocks within the purple box is assumed to be known, and we account for that with the measurements, there is no danger of them overlapping over the footer. We can therefore arrange the 2 sidebars and the content box perfectly by floating the sidebars left and right, while the content box remains centered in between. All that remains is for the footer to be pinned to the bottom as well, with absolute positioning and bottom offset of 0. Now, when we resize the window, if the window is larger than the minimum height of the box, the footer sticks to the bottom edge, we don't get a gap there. Here is a mock-up of the layout in use, populated with content. Working as expected. And that completes this tutorial. I leave you with the relevant CSS properties and values again. For formatting CSS properties, there is no shortage of online references, and they are mostly self-explanatory. I hope this has been of use. Do feel free to leave a comment and subscribe for future updates.